Hey everyone, welcome to a new video in our Unity 3D first-person shooter series. In this video, we're going to get our gun actually shooting bullets. So in the last video, we created a gun shooting script, so we're going to open that up. Again, if you don't have Visual Studio, I highly recommend it. Okay, here's our gun shooting script. Now, before we actually start scripting, we want to tell our game where we want the bullets to spawn when we shoot. And we want the bullets to spawn somewhere where our gun is. So just find your character in the scene and zoom in somewhere until you see the gun. Okay, there you go, you can see the gun. You can see that this sound is in the way a bit, so just click the sound icon or come into your first person character prefab and look for shooting sound and just move it down a bit. And same with whatever the sound that is. Nope. Undo. Make sure if you accidentally move your character, you undo it. So I think it's the reload sound. Nope. Hit marker sound. There you go. Move that out of the way until you can see the barrel of the gun. Now, next thing you're going to do is create a empty game object, and you can do that by right-clicking here in the hierarchy. Right-click and create empty. Now, when you create a empty game object, up here in the inspector, you can click and rename it. So I'm going to rename this to something like Firepoint, because this is where we're going to fire the bullets from. Now, similar to what we did in video 3, we're going to drag that onto the gun so that the fire point follows the gun and rotates with the gun. And then we're going to change its position to 0 in all the X, Y, and Z axes. And then we're just going to move it to the tip of the gun. And that's in line with the gun because it's attached now to the gun. So 0 on the X, Y, and Z axes are all 0 with the center point of the gun. So it's exactly in line, and we've just moved it a bit so that it's right in front of the barrel. When you're moving it around, make sure your move tool is on so that you can see. So this is your move tool, this one over here, so that you can see where the corner of the object is. Because this is an empty game object, it doesn't have a 3D model. So it exists, you just can't see it. Okay, so go back now into our script. And we want to create two things. We want to create a empty public transform for our Firepoint, and I'm just going to call it Firepoint again. And we also need a game object for our bullet so that we know what we are actually going to be firing. Now, if you don't know what I just did here or a little bit confused about this, watch the last video on components, objects, and variables, and we go into detail about it. It's good you get a basic understanding of this because from here on out we'll be using it a lot. Okay, now because I made those both public, if I go to my FPS controller where that script is attached to, I see now a fire point and a bullet show up in the inspector. And both currently are assigned to nothing, that's why you see those none. And for the fire point, whatever we drag into there will save a transform, which is a component, this component up here. So this component up here. And all game objects have that transform. So if I click on any of these, bullet test, it all has that transform. Now, Later on, when we get a bit more advanced, you will find some without that type of transform, but we'll get to that. So for now, everything basic has that transform, and I have to tell it what my fire point is. So I can do that just by clicking here on my fire point in the hierarchy and dragging it into that fire point transform. And now I have to do the same with bullet, but our bullet is a prefab. So if I go back into our prefabs where we created the bullet, click back on FPS controller where our script is attached to, and I'm going to drag that bullet into game object. Excellent. Now in the script, whenever I talk about the fire point, it's going to know that I'm talking about this fire point here that we had just attached to the weapon. So this one. And it knows that the bullet I'm talking about is this one in our prefabs that we created, I think 2 videos ago now. Excellent. Now, what we want to do to fire is I want it to map to my space keyboard. Actually, no, I want it to be my left mouse control. So to get started with that, I'm going to click into my update function, and I'm going to create something called an if statement. And an if statement goes something like this. You have if, the word, and then you have a pair of open and close brackets, and then you have a pair of open and close braces. Now, in coding, these brackets will usually have some piece of vital information. So in the case of the if statement, it's called the condition. And a condition is just something that evaluates to either true or false. For example, in here, if I said 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, that's going to be true. And if whatever I type in here, so the condition evaluates to true, it's going to run whatever's in the braces. If it evaluates to false, it'll just skip this line of code. So remember, update gets run once every frame. So every frame it's going to come down here, come to your if statement, check what's inside the condition. If it's true, it's going to run this. If it's false, it's going to skip it and move to the next line of code that we'll have after. Now, the condition we want to put starts with something called input and then dot. So input is also a game object that we can't really see. Well, not a game object, but an object that we can't see. And I'll go into a little bit of detail. Up here in Unity, if you hit edit and then project settings and then input, you bring up something called the input manager. And in the input manager, you have a whole bunch of axes. Now, these axes are labeled things similar to what most games have. So most games will have some sort of fire. Most games will have some sort of horizontal movement and vertical movement, or a jump. So I want to use this fire1 control, right? And there's each of these axes, are mapped to certain keys on the keyboard or mouse controls, or in some cases, joysticks. And the reason they use these inputs is because it's easy then, once you publish your game, for a user to swap out whatever their input device is. For example, if I manually coded it to only shoot when I click my left mouse button, and then a user plugs in a joystick, the game won't know what to do. However, if I use these axes, up here you can see this is called fire1. I'll just highlight that for you. Right, up here you have a fire1, and then down here you also have a fire1. And the reason for that is this fire1 up here is the type of key or mouse button. which means it responds to a key or mouse button. And then this fire1 down here responds to a joystick. So it's mapped to joystick button 0. So if I code it to these axes and the user gets rid of their mouse and keyboard and plugs in a joystick, the game will still know what input they're trying to use. Okay, so here I know that I'm going to be using the fire1. If I want to change these controls, so I can just click in here. There's a positive and an alt positive. So left control is fire1. And then down here, mouse 0 is also fire1. If you want to change that to, say, the Z key, you just get rid of it and type in Z. Okay, but I want to leave it at mouse 0 for now. So if I want to code that axis, I just have to remember what that name is. So fire1 and the exact spelling. So fire1 with a capital F. Now I'm going to go back to my script. And inside my if block, I have the word input, which is just our way of telling Unity that we're using some of its input functions. And the one we're going to use is called getButton, like so. And then we have to put a pair of brackets as well. And then inside getButton, we want to put in quotation marks the name of the axis we're trying to access. So fire1. So all this bit of code is, so that's our condition, and that code is just going to return true if the user or the player presses down on the fire1 button or whatever keys are mapped to fire1, which in our case is left control or the first mouse button or the middle joystick button. If that button's not being pressed, it's just going to skip this whole if block. Now you also, actually I'll let this play first. Yeah, that's the input. We're going to be going a whole lot more into detail about inputs in the next video. So if that's a little confusing, don't worry about it for now. Just type the code as is. And then inside our braces. Now braces in coding just collects a whole bunch of statements or a whole bunch of code. For example, here you have an open brace and braces are always paired. So you have an open brace there and a closing brace here, right? So all of these we know are children or are contained inside this class. And it's the same thing here with your update. You have an open brace there and a closing brace here. Oh, sorry, and a closing brace here. So we know everything we put in here are contained inside that update block. So it's just a way of containing code. So same thing with our if statement. We're just going to collect the code we want to run if our condition is true. And the code we want to run is something called Instantiate, which is a function. Now, if you remember to maths days, in maths, a function is just something that takes in some input, does some calculations, and then spits out an output. So so functions in most programming languages use these brackets. So similar to a condition, but you'll put in the name of the function instead of if. Right, so in if, you put the word if, and then the brackets. In a function, you type in the name of the function, and then the brackets. Now, another example of a function we just used is this .getButton function. So this .getButton function used these braces. So getButton was the name of the function. Then you had the two brackets. And then inside the brackets, you had something called a parameter. And a parameter is just an input. So you can type in inputs just like that. So you could have like an input 1, an input 2, and an input 3. Later on, we'll be creating our own functions and you'll see how this all works. But some of these functions that come custom with Uni, including this instantiate function, have to have certain inputs. And the first of that is what we want to instantiate. And what we want to instantiate is a bullet, right? So we'll type in our bullet. And then the inputs have to be separated by commas. And then we want to tell it where we want it to be instantiated. And we want it to be instantiated at our fire point. So I'm going to type in fire point for now. Now, it's not just going to be at our fire point, because our fire point is this whole transform component, which is, go back to our fire point, all of this. So it's not just our position, it's our position, rotation, and scale. So if I want to only access its position, I can type in fire point and then dot and then position. And that will give it just that X, Y, and Z values of its position. Right. Now, the last one, the last input needed is what way to face, so its rotation. And we also want it to be rotated at our fire point. So we'll type in fire point dot rotation. Just like so. Now later on, if I want to access just its X position, right, I could type in fire point. So it's the fire point is just a transform component, and then put in dot position. And remember, dot position is the X, Y, and Z components. And then I could just put in dot X for just X. So that's how those work, but you'll get more practice with it. So that line of code should instantiate. So we'll save it. And I'm going to go back to Unity now, and I'm going to wait for it to compile and then hit play. So you can see that I'm spawning multiple objects, and we'll get that fixed in the next video when we talk about inputs. And our bullets are currently not flying, and we'll also get that fixed in the next video. So that's it for this video. If you've successfully got your bullets spawning, you're ready to move on to the next video.